Managing audio clips in a project can be time-consuming, and it's not always a smooth workflow. This goes double if you want to use the same sound effect clip in multiple places inside your project. So we thought we'd provide an example of a sound effects system or workflow that could be built with Odin Inspector. It's certainly not the only way to do it, and you may want to make different design decisions that are tailored to your project or your design preferences. The goal is to be able to add a single property to a class that will then be able to access audio clips using just a couple drop-down menus to select the exact clip we want. In addition, by selecting that clip, previously set values such as volume and pitch for that clip will be reused. The way that we've designed the system will require 3 different classes, and we'll make use of a 4th class as an example of how to implement that system. The first class that we need to create is a scriptable object that will hold the audio clip as well as a handful of audio settings. It's a common approach to use a list of audio clips rather than just a singular audio clip. This allows a clip to be selected at random. For something like footsteps, this can add more variety so that each step doesn't sound exactly the same. We're going to skip that option in this video for simplicity, but we wanted to point it out as an option for you and your project. It's also worth noting that this scriptable object is very much optional, but the additional audio settings will allow some variation in the audio properties each time that a sound effect is played. This can add a little juice or polish to your game with minimal effort on your part. If you like to skip the scriptable object, you can simply use audio clips directly and skip to the next section of the video. If you do want to use them, then let's talk about how we created the scriptable object. It has 5 fields. The first is an audio clip, and the last 4 are floats. These 4 float values will control the volume and pitch of the clip when it's played. 2 of the float values will provide variation in the volume and pitch, which allows for some degree of randomness when the clip is played. Then to make the scriptable object a bit easier to use and more organized, we can add range attributes and titles, like so. We can also add a required attribute to the audio clip to help ensure that it gets assigned at design time. I've also added a space attribute at the top for formatting, as things can get more squished than I might like. Before we get any further into the code, I want to create a folder structure for our sound effects clips. In my case, I'll add an audio folder and then 3 subfolders for 3 different types or categories of sound effect. For your use, add as many folders as you have distinct categories for sound effect. We'll be making use of these folders in the SFX Manager to help organize the sound effects clips. So let's start to build the Sound Effects Manager. As mentioned before, it will host lists with sound effects clips or just lists of audio clips if you've skipped creating the scriptable object. The Sound Effects Manager will also hold reference to a default audio source, which can be convenient for 2D sound effects that aren't in the scene, such as UI sound effects, or maybe even ambient sounds, depending on your project's design. We've also added a singleton to our Sound Effects Manager for further convenience and ease of access. We then need to decorate the fields with attributes. A horizontal group can be added to the default audio source, as we'll be adding a button a little bit later that we want to group with this field. Adding a serialized field attribute will give us access to this private field in the inspector. You'll notice that we'll do this several times throughout the video. We can then add tab group attributes so that each list of sound effects clips will be in its own tab. To make use of our folder structure, we can add an asset list attribute to each of the lists. This attribute can be given the relevant path in the project and set to auto-populate. Odin will then be able to grab the assets and stick them into our list without much work on our part. Next, we need a couple of functions. The first will be a static function that will play the sound effect. It'll have 3 input parameters. The first is the sound effects clip to be played. The second is a boolean that will control whether the audio source should play the incoming sound effect when another clip is already playing. And the final input is an audio source. This is used if the default audio source is not intended to be used. Note that both the boolean and the audio source have default values to make the function a little bit easier to use. Then inside the function, we can assign the default audio source if none was specified in the input parameter. We'll do one more null check, and if the audio source is still null, we'll throw an error to let the designers know that they missed a step. After that, we check if the audio source is not playing, or if we want to interrupt the audio source. If either of these are true, then we'll set the audio clip, the volume, the pitch, and finally, we'll make the audio source play the audio clip. Notice that we've used the variation in the audio settings to add a little randomness. I found that this can make even a simple button click sound more interesting. The second function will be called by a button to find an audio source, or if it can't be found, add an audio source to the SFX Manager game object. We can decorate this function with a button attribute, give it a little color, Make sure the button is shown only when the default audio source is null, and finally, add it to the horizontal group of the audio source. Our final step in the SFX Manager is to create an enum with different types of sound effects. I've chosen to add it to the SFX Manager as it feels like a central and easy to find location. But you could also argue that it should be in the class that we're going to create next. The next class is the type that will add to other classes to be able to easily add sound effects. This class will provide an easy-to-use interface in the inspector, as well as an easy way to play the sound effect with code. This class will also make heavy use of Odin attributes, but before we get to those, we need to add the fields and the functions for this class. The first is an enum for the type of sound effect this object will play. We then need to create an instance of the SFX Clip class and a string that will be a label for that sound effect clip. Next, two booleans will be used to control what is shown in the editor and whether what is shown can be edited. This will help control clutter and prevent unintentional editing. Next, we have another instance of a sound effects clip. This will be used solely in displaying the inspector for the sound effects clip that has been selected, whereas the instance above will be used in the actual selection and will make use of a drop-down menu. Then we have two more booleans. The first will control the wait to play option, and the second will control whether we use the default audio source in the SFX Manager, or if we want to select a different audio source. And finally, we have an audio source that can be used to override the default audio source. With all the variables created, we now need to create 4 functions. The first 3 are private and will be used internally with Odin attributes. The first will be called when a new sound effect clip is selected from a dropdown and will update the values of 2 of our variables. The second function will be called by a button in the inspector to select the sound effect clip object in the project folders. The last private function will be called when a new sound effect clip type is selected, or in other words, when the enum value changes. This function returns a list of sound effects clips from the SFX Manager. These lists will then be used to populate the drop-down menu. The last function is a public function that can be called to play the audio clip. Inside the function, we can make one of 2 calls to the SFX Manager that depends on whether the default audio source is intended to be used or not. And now onto the attributes. There's a lot going on in this particular class, and we'll be adding quite a few attributes. So back up to the enum, we can add an onValueChanged attribute that calls the SFX change function to keep the inspector values updated. I'll also add an inline button that will call the play sound effect function so you can easily test the selected sound effect directly from the inspector. And lastly, I'll add 2 attributes to format the label a bit more. On the sound effects clip, we'll add similar attributes, but with the addition of a value dropdown attribute that will get its values from the sound effects type function. Also, the label text attribute will pull its value from the sound effects label string variable. The value of the string gets updated, so the label will match the category of sound effects being selected. This is absolutely not necessary, but it's a nice bit of polish. The rest of the variables are all private, but we want to be able to access them in the inspector, so we can add the serialized field attribute to all of them. Then with one exception, all the rest of the attributes added will be showIf, disableIf, and enableIf, using the Boolean values to control the visibility of the fields. The one exception is an inline editor added to the sound effects clip so that the full inspector is shown. This will allow us to edit the settings in the inspector rather than needing to find the scriptable object in the project. And that's it. The system is now complete and ready to be implemented. To do that, we need to first add the SFX Manager to a scene object. In our SFX Manager, we can click the red button to add an audio source, and then in each of the tabs, we can press the plus button to add an instance of the sound effects clip to each of the lists. This also adds them to the correct folder in our project. Each instance of the sound effects clip will then need an audio clip assigned to it and the audio settings adjusted to your preferences. Finally, to create a simple example of how to make use of this system, we can create one more class. In the new class, we can create an instance of the sound effects class, and then just as an example, using the start function, we can call the play sound effects function on the sound effects object to play the sound effect. Then back to the scene, we can add an instance of this example class to a scene object to see the inspector that we've created and all of its functionality. With the system we've created, it really is that easy to add sound effects to your scripts and manage all of your audio clips in your project. So we hope that was interesting, or better yet, useful for you and your project. And until next time, happy game designing.